Okay, I think we'll make a start now. So good morning or good afternoon, everybody, from those from all around the world that are joining us today. Lovely to have you. Welcome to our first instalment of Taking Integrity Online, a special three-part series to help you uphold academic integrity as we look toward an unexpected and what could be a permanent future of blended learning. For this special three-part webinar series, we've partnered with higher education integrity specialists from the University of Northampton, Nottingham Trent University, and Loughborough University, who are all actively managing the challenges of upholding academic integrity in a remote environment. My name is Deborah Horrocks, Senior Field Account Manager at Turnitin. I'm based in the UK and I'll be your host today. I'm very pleased to be joined on this call today by Robin Crockett from the University of Northampton in the UK. Robin is the University Lead on Contract Cheating. So before we make a start, I'd like to cover a few basic webinar housekeeping rules. Today's session will last no longer than 45 minutes. All attendees will be muted for the entirety of the webinar. However, you can use the Zoom Q&A at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions to Robin that you'd like to be addressed at the end of the webinar. We ask that you only use the chat to say hello. For any questions we deem unsuitable for broadcast, facilitators are on hand in the background to respond to you via text. I'm also pleased to advise that the recording of this session will be available in 48 to 72 hours from now. We'll of course send you an email to let you know when this is available. So now that the sober stuff is out of the way, let's begin. So we're here today because education in particular is facing challenges that at the beginning of 2020 we could never have envisaged. Institutions have had to adjust their entire structures, and for many educators that has meant being thrust into distance learning environments without time to study or plan for change. We are in an unprecedented situation, and educators everywhere are encountering valid concerns. One question is how to uphold academic integrity when students are not physically in a classroom. As we all know, contract cheating, also known as commissioning, is a growing trend in academic misconduct globally. In a nutshell, when students engage in contract cheating, they earn credit for work they didn't do and material they didn't learn. A huge 16% of students admit to paying a third party to complete their work for them during their university career. For instructors who try to prevent contract cheating by conducting in-class or exam hall writing assignments, there may be new challenges in this remote learning landscape. The transition to remote learning can be stressful, and when students are stressed, lack connection to learning and to their teachers, and they are struggling, they may be more tempted to take shortcut solutions like cheating. Contract cheating, specifically, is an increased possibility because it may be more tempting for students to ask their friends or online sites to write their essays for them without detection when they feel isolated and unseen. As contract cheating and commissioning becomes increasingly widespread and cheaper by the day, it's important that academic institutions respond and adjust their procedures and practices. Today, in an exclusive interview, Dr. Robin Crockett will provide tips and advice to help educators proceed when they feel an assignment doesn't look right. So let's begin, Robin. Please, can you tell us a bit about yourself and why you're here today?
Okay, yes, I've been Reader in Data Analysis at the University of Northampton for several years, much of that overlapping with also being an academic integrity officer. I'm a mathematician, and the data aspects of the integrity officer role increasingly caught my attention, such that Turnitin took an interest in what I was doing, and to the point where, as of September last year, my university semi-formally gave me a partial role as the University Lead on Contract Cheating. And along with Sandy Dan at Loughborough and Irene Glendinning at Coventry, I co-founded the Midlands Integrity Group last summer. My main research interest in this area, as a research reader, is stylometry as relevant to short documents such as student assignments?
Thanks for the introduction, Robin. So in the 8 years you've been an academic integrity officer, how exposed have you been to the issue of contract cheating?
Well, the second investigation I undertook all those years ago involved contract cheating, which was something as a baptism of fire and a very, very steep learning curve. Since then, over the years, I've seen a huge proliferation of providers, such as essay mills, freelancers, ghostwriters, etc., and a corresponding drop in prices charged to students. And basically, in order of magnitude terms, so, not just tens of pounds or dollars of euros. So assignments that previously cost many tens to a few hundreds of pounds now tend to cost a few tens to several tens of pounds, or maybe 100 and something pounds.
So because the prices have dropped, I imagine that there's so many more contract cheating cases. Is that correct? Are you seeing an increase in the number of contract cheating cases being identified in your institution?
Yes, there's a lot more cases due to the increased availability of companies that do this, accompanied by the drop in prices. But there's also an increase in the number of cases identified by tutors due to their increased and increasing awareness of the problem in the higher education community. They're increasingly learning what to look out for, which is what we're about this afternoon.
It's reassuring to know that tutors are on the lookout and can access resources to help them with such a task. So, Robin, what's your main objective when investigating contract cheating? Why do you bother with this mammoth task?
Well, we have a duty of care to our students, as do all education institutions. We need to catch students who commission, or on the other side, ghostwrite or facilitate these things at the earliest opportunity, to persuade them back to their honest endeavour before cheating habits get embedded.
And what are your thoughts on prevention tactics?
Yeah, it's important that we stop students contract cheating to avoid the risk of subsequent, including post-graduation discovery and risk of exposure and or blackmail.
So does blackmail really happen? In what capacity do you see blackmail?
Yeah, anecdotally at least, some essay mills, ghostwriters, etc., blackmail students who've commissioned before into commissioning further work, or indeed making further payments for work that's already been paid for, by threatening to expose them to their institutions or to their employers, professional bodies, etc. It's difficult to put our finger on it, but I took a phone call a couple of months back, which I'm convinced was a phishing call to trick me into giving ID information. It didn't succeed.
It's really, really admirable that your contract cheating preventative work is for the benefit of your students. But do you consider this from an institutional point of view as well?
Yes, yeah. From an institutional point of view, in common with all education and higher education institutions, we want and need to protect the integrity of our awards, our brand, if you want, which in turn helps to protect the sector as a whole.
So, Robin, if an institution was to be involved in a contract cheating scandal, could this impact the many graduates seeking employment?
Yeah, it definitely could. We need to ensure that honest students' awards are not compromised by doubt regarding their value by employers and graduate recruiters, etc., due to a perception that an individual institution or institutions doesn't take the problem seriously, doesn't proactively investigate, or possibly even is perceived as turning a blind eye.
So are you able to give us a rundown of how a suspected case of commissioning might come to your attention, please?
At the outset, as integrity officers, we're usually approached by a tutor due to an assignment or paper just possessing some undefined, unfocused sense of wrongness, something that doesn't fit but might not be showing the usual indicators of what we could call everyday copy and paste plagiarism. That said, it's important to note that this sense of wrongness can quite simply arise as a result of everyday copy and paste plagiarism, or collusion, or by students borrowing computers, or simply by coincidence. And we must remember that with regard to assignments submitted by an individual student, when they're considered, or if they're considered individually, they might look a little bit questionable, but on balance of probabilities, not questionable enough to trigger an investigation. However, when considered collectively, those same assignments might be inconsistent with each other to the point of actually being mutually exclusive as being a single individual student's work.
So tell me a little bit more about the balance of probabilities.
Well, the aim is to build a body of evidence. Trying to build a body of evidence as part of a case within the appropriate policies and procedures to be considered on balance of probabilities, as which we might come across in civil law in the UK or England, but not beyond reasonable doubt, which is the sort of threshold or criterion for criminal law. In essence, looking for an answer to two linked questions. Is it more likely the student commissioned a third party to prepare their assignment in whole or in part, which they then submitted? Or the other side, is it more likely the student prepared their assignment entirely by their own honest endeavour, but in a manner that somehow resulted in a set of suspicious features?
That sounds super tricky. I guess it can take a lot of time to get a clear balance of probabilities either way. Is that right?
Yes, an investigation can take several hours, indeed up to several days, usually spread over a couple of weeks, as it's important to take timeouts to collate evidence and take stock, possibly bringing other assignments or students into the investigation. Also, such investigations can involve more than one investigator.
So that suggests universities need to allow more time and resources.
Yes, indeed. And in the UK, at least, the recently published second edition of the QAA's guidance on contracting to cheat in higher education has some advice in this regard.
Okay, I think that sets the context. Thank you. Shall we look at some specifics?
Okay, let's start with what a grading tutor might see. Some possible more obvious telltales. And first, has the essay mill or ghostwriter left an ID or order reference in the document file name or the document itself, possibly as a running header or a comment or a markup on the title page? This happens, or the telltales that it's happened happen. And so does, for example, a ghostwriter putting a placeholder in the text for the student to fill in some details, e.g. name or mentor name for a reflective report, and the student has missed it. They've just taken the file they've bought, not checked it and submitted it. And that happens too. And we've just got the first of a few slides up here. This tries to highlight what you might see on a title page that a ghostwriter or an essay mill's left in and the student's not picked up. On the left, you've got a whole load of placeholders, and where the ghostwriter or essay mill has put square brackets in for the student to put their course name and assignment title and their submission title and name and things on there, and the students missed it. On the right, we've got something that looks more like a typical sort of order reference you might see. And I would just note here that so far as I know, there is no essay mill called Cracktastic Essays. That's entirely without reference to anybody known to exist. But you get an essay mill name and or an order reference number and or a brief description of what's being commissioned and the timeline for it. And you might get a name or email address as well, who it's being sent to. Okay, the next slide shows what you might see by way of running headers. Now, if you see something which says, for example, running head, the Black Death, and then just works through sort of introduction, summary, discussion, conclusions, etc., that's probably okay. But if you see running head and then something that looks like an order number with possibly a word count, with possibly a delivery date or a commissioning date in it, then that's probably not okay, because there'd be no reason for a student to put that sort of information in as a running head. But for a ghostwriter, possibly working on several assignments at the same point in time, it's a vitally important placeholder and reminder for them. So now I think we're on for the third slide. Just a couple more telltales to really round off this little section. On the left, I've got something that if you saw something like that would probably be okay, and something on the right which would probably be culpable. And the difference is, on the left, somebody has put in, without any sort of evidence of annotations or placeholders, BA history, an assignment descriptor, their title, their name, their student number, a submission date, and a word count. In the right, they're all inside square brackets, or maybe round brackets or curly brackets, or some other annotation to indicate that this is where a ghostwriter has said to the student, you need to put your information here, and the student hasn't taken out the placeholders. Okay, just moving on a bit, and without slides just for a little while. What is the Turnitin or other similarity score with the bibliography excluded? Is it anomalously or atypically low, such as 0 or 1 or 2 or 3%, or maybe 4 or 5% even? And does the assignment also have some awkward or convoluted wording where a writer has tried to avoid some standard jargon? The only reason to avoid standard jargon would be to keep the similarity score down. Many essay mills and ghostwriters offer so-called plagiarism-free or Turnitin proof, etc. guarantees. So this sort of feature, the low similarity score, and some good but convoluted wording is a good indicator that a ghostwriter has taken unusual steps, let's say, just to keep a headline similarity score down. And then the last little bit here is just what about the page size and the paragraph alignments and the language settings? Are these what you'd expect from the student? Does the assignment in these sorts of terms look like others the student has submitted, or at least submitted over the same preparation time frame? And if not, why would a student produce very different looking assignments over the same time frame, unless it's been specified for some reason according to the assignment or one of the assignments in question? And this next slide that Laura's just put up for us has just got two basic page sizes. So you've got the relatively short, fat US letter, which in Microsoft Word often comes with 1 1/4 inch margins. And just within that, in dummy text, I've shown some different paragraph alignments and line spacings. And then on the right, we've got what's more normal for the UK at least, the sort of taller, thinner A4 page size with, again, what Word commonly puts in as default 2.5 centimetre margins. And again, with a similar set of fully justified and left-hand justified and different line spacings. So if you get 2 assignments or more than 2 assignments submitted by the same student over the same sort of general time frame, and they've got very different appearances in this regard for no obvious reason to do with the individual assignments, why? It wouldn't generally happen.
Well, thank you for that insight, Robin. I guess it gets a bit more focused and labour intensive from there.
Yes, indeed. But some things can still stand out once you get your eye in, so to speak. And in no particular order, but first, look at the reference list. Is it in the expected or specified format? If you toggle the big, if you go forward a bit, and in Turnitin or similar, if you toggle the bibliography included excluded option, are the references identified as blocks from single sources rather than by individual references? Ghostwriters can recycle reference lists from assignment to assignment. So a reference list that's sort of list-wise or block-wise similar, rather than individual reference-wise similar, can be an indicator of this. Second, and again to do with references, are the citations specific at the correct points in the text, or are they generic and at approximately correct points in the text? A ghostwriter in the hurry, and particularly if they're not being paid very much, might sprinkle basically appropriate but generic references into the text at about the correct places, but not take the time and effort to find some specific references and cite them at the specific points they're needed. Third, and here it gets a little more complicated, is the assignment written in the right focus and voice? And by that, I mean the interrelated aspects of, for example, does it read like it's been written by an experienced writer or a student who's learning? So irrespective of bad grammar, strange wording and things, does it have a sense that it's written by somebody who really knows what they're about, or does it look more like a student who's learning? Are there gender references in there that don't align with the student? Is it well written and presented, but missing the specific focus of the assignment? So, for example, just going back to the previous couple of slides, is it about the Black Death, but in a general sense, rather than in a more specific sense that might have been set by a history tutor? And then just the last little bullet point here, does it look like high quality writing that's been dumbed down? For example, advanced expert vocabulary coupled with bad sentence construction and dodgy grammar. Generally, expert vocabulary goes with good sentence construction and grammar. So if you get the mismatch here with expert vocabulary and bad sentence construction and grammar and punctuation, etc., again, that can indicate an expert writer, but dumbing down to make it look like a student submitting for a second class honours essay, for example. Okay, moving on a little bit from those previous points, but a little more focused on the individual student and consistency amongst all the assignments they've submitted. For example, is the use of apostrophes and hyphens and general punctuational idiosyncrasies consistent? We all punctuate things slightly differently, but you would expect consistency from one assignment to the next, particularly if they're submitted at close points in time. And moving on just a little bit, is the use of commas and dashes consistent, or colons versus semicolons, or single quotes versus double quotes, or single versus double spaces after full stops at the end of sentences? You know, we all have our own little habits here, all of them correct, but we tend to be pretty consistent. So an assignment submitted by a student that's very different in one or more of these regards can indicate that it wasn't the student who wrote it. And then headings, subheadings, bullet points, fonts and sizes, lines and paragraph spacing and indents. Again, we all tend to have our habits here and we tend to be pretty consistent. So,
wow, that's quite a lot, Robin. I guess you've got more.
Yeah, afraid so. But this is the last bit, and it's just moving on a little bit more and beginning to do a bit of delving into the documents. And this is what to look for in the document properties metadata that's reported by example Microsoft Word or the open source LibreOffice, etc. And I've got a few slides coming up that just highlight what you might see and where to look for. So the first step is to download the file that the student submitted, direct from Turnitin or whatever course management software you're using. Don't rely on a copy that's forwarded by somebody else, such as a tutor, because it's too easy to accidentally resave a document and that can update the metadata. And if you do accidentally resave something, you'll need to download a fresh copy to make sure you get the metadata as it stood when the student submitted. So you've got your file, you've downloaded it, it's a clean copy. So open it in the appropriate software, such as Microsoft Word or LibreOffice. And here I tend to use LibreOffice even for doc and docx files because it presents the document properties a little more straightforwardly. And also here I'd note that PDFs tend to contain less of this sort of information. So you're in Word or LibreOffice or Adobe Acrobat Reader, etc. Click on Properties or Document Properties, etc. in the menu pull down and look at the creating and last saving times and author names and any company name, any document properties, etc. And on this slide, we've just got the general and summary views that you get from Microsoft Word Macintosh versions. 365 and Windows versions will do things slightly differently, but you'll still get this same basic information. And if you see a whole load of clutter under the summary that looks like an order reference and or some basic title that wouldn't be used by a student, and an author that suggests a ghostwriter, and maybe a manager that suggests a ghostwriter, and then a company name that suggests an essay mill, and maybe some comments, again, the sort of thing that a ghostwriter might do just to help them keep track of what they're working on, but something that looks like it's an order reference and quick descriptor, then these are things that a student would have no need to put in. So again, it's part of the evidence to be considered along with any other evidence. The next slide is just a little bit more on what you might see in Word. If you go to content, you might get another indicator that there's a title or placeholder or header, not of the sort you'd see from a student doing their own work. And then on the right-hand side here, under the custom properties, you might get some custom properties that are put in by an essay mill or a ghostwriter. And I've just illustrated that in the form of an email address, which I have seen, but you can get other information in there. And the next couple of slides are showing the same things, but as viewed from LibreOffice. And LibreOffice is particularly helpful because it collates the creating author time and date and the last modifying or last saving author time and date on the same view. And then the other properties that just quickly hurtled through in Word are also visible in LibreOffice, but in a slightly different combination. But you would still get, if there's a telltale in the document title, you'd still see it. And if there are any comments just as reminders to an essay mill or ghostwriter who's doing what and when, you get at that as well. And just moving forwards onto the 8th slide, here's just picking up a couple more things, particularly the custom properties there. And again, LibreOffice just collates information slightly differently, but you can still get, if there's a dodgy company name, etc., you can still get at it. Okay, so that's what you get just from clicking, or can get just from clicking on properties and document properties. Elsewhere in Word or LibreOffice, etc., look at page settings, language settings, and are these as you would expect? For example, in the UK, British/UK English and American/US English are fairly common. But less common are Australian or Canadian English, unless, of course, the student is Australian or Canadian, which would be relatively easy to check. And would you expect a non-Indian student to set their assignment setting, put their assignment settings to Indian English or any other variant of English? So just check that it fits with what you would expect and is consistent with what the student has submitted previously. And lastly, just something else to do with the document that you've downloaded is to toggle the track changes and comment settings. That can be very, very revealing. And I've just put up on the slide that's just come up the sorts of things that you can see if you toggle this, because sometimes students turn track changes and comments off, but don't otherwise get rid of the evidence trail. And I have seen things like this when students have submitted personal reflections that they've sent out for commission. And this is a student apparently reflecting on their training replacement at this fictional craptastic essays with the dates. That looks okay at headline level. But if you flip these settings, you can sometimes see that that's been put over and above a placeholder from the writer to the student saying you need to put your placement details here or something like that. So it's well worth just doing that toggle and scrolling through and seeing if anything comes up. And I'd just like to make a quick comment that authorship, which I think is coming out as part of Turnitin originality in its next iteration, can do several things. Some of them are more complex than we can consider here. However, in the immediate context, authorship can collate assignments for you as submitted by an individual student and present the basic document properties and metadata without the need for you or tutors to manually download everything and manually check everything. And that can make a huge reduction in the time taken to investigate your suspicions. And just, if nothing else, do a headline triage for, is there something here to investigate, or is it just one of those things?
So before we move into our attendee Q&A, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Just some concluding comments on evidence, really. First, you should suspect in the general case to have to assemble a body of evidence across a portfolio of assignments. Simply considering a single assignment in isolation will generally not suffice, although it's nice when it does. And also, just with regard to the sort of document properties and metadata we've just rattled through, dodgy looking document properties and metadata might have innocent explanations, such as a student borrowing computers and not changing settings. But a student taking some relatively simple precautions can resave a commissioned document such that it shows few, if any, of these telltales.
That's a really pertinent point, Robin. In the present day, law enforcement has even been found to use metadata as part of its criminal investigations. But the fact that metadata doesn't reveal the bigger picture, then this begs the question of whether metadata alone is substantial enough to solve a crime. Or from our standpoint, is it sufficient enough to solve an academic misconduct investigation?
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes you get lucky and the metadata unequivocally reveals a ghostwriter or essay mill. More generally, however, metadata forms part of the evidence, which can include other aspects as I've outlined today, or indeed need some forensic stylometric linguistic analysis, etc. And the metadata isn't sufficient without that other evidence. And just finally, to pick up on, sometimes we manage to get lucky. Some students aren't very bright, let's be honest. It's almost unbelievable what you can find if you do a bit of Googling. This slide that Laura's just put up for us shows the footprints left by a student who used their own name and their own email address, the same one that they were using to communicate with me during the investigation, to register with a commissioning website and then give feedback to the ghost coder who did their computing assignment for them. And I've redacted these, but where I've put student was unequivocally the student's own name and email address as they'd used to communicate with me during the investigation.
Wow.
It doesn't get a lot better than that, really.
What were they thinking? Nothing surprises me anymore. Thanks for providing a great insight into contract cheating investigation today, Robin. I'm sure everyone is feeling a lot more clued up on the telltale signs of this form of academic misconduct. While my questioning is over, we have lots of questions in our Q&A box from our audience today, so I hope you're ready.
Okay, let's see what's there.
We have a question here from Helen Andrew. We had a TOK essay that we were suspicious about. A low originality report came up, but we were told that there was a similarity with another student in another school. When we asked that school if we could have access, liaise with them, they did not reply. So we never knew whether the two students had used an external third-party provider.
Yeah, that can be a pain, but we have to be careful when responding to inquiries, requests to share documents from other institutions that we don't know about, because sadly there are academic staff and other staff at institutions who are involved in this trade, and we have to be on our guard that they're not trying to trap us into giving student ID information, or otherwise doing things that breach confidentiality.
We have another question. How can educators identify a paper or papers as plagiarized when it takes so long to critically analyze the information and colleagues haven't the time to look at it further? We have policies in place, but I don't recall teachers identifying issues with management during the 2 years I am teaching, even when it's likely but not absolute. Most teachers handle independently through mercenary techniques, i.e. capping grades.
Well, I would suggest that just mercenary techniques such as capping grades is not sufficient, but I can understand why busy tutors do it. It's not sufficient because it doesn't get the student noticed, doesn't get them into a position where they're interviewed by somebody like me or one of my oppos at another institution. So they basically don't get the message that they shouldn't do this. It can get them into lots of trouble down the line. And, we can also refer them into support mechanisms.
I've just seen a great question from Kevin O'Connor. Are there best practices for how the decision is reported to a student?
Yeah, I mean, the best practice is to report it clearly and unequivocally. Tell them that they've done something wrong. Tell them why it's wrong, and refer them to the appropriate aspects of policy and the appropriate support mechanisms at your university or institution. Because there's the disciplinary aspect, which is telling them they've done something wrong and imposing any appropriate penalty within the policy, but there is the duty of care and support aspect, which is referring them to people who can help them.
Well, we have lots and lots of questions in the Q&A. Unfortunately, we can't get through all of them, but thank you so much, Robin, for your fantastic answers. So we do have resources available. So if you'd like to expand your knowledge on contract cheating, we invite you to take a look at some of the resources we've created. Go visit turnitin.com/contract cheating. Thank you once again, Robin, for such an interesting overview of contract cheating investigation process and for helping the education professionals who've joined us today to identify the signs that their students' work may not be their own. If anybody has any questions about what Robin has covered today, please do take note of our email address now on screen and we'll get back to you as quickly as possible. Again, thank you everybody for spending time with us today. Bye.
Yes, thank you.